Pope Leo XIV walked through the ornate corridors of the Vatican, his white robes rustling against marble floors that had witnessed centuries of ceremony. But today, something stirred within him that no amount of tradition could contain. The formal, papal audience had concluded moments earlier, leaving behind the familiar weight of protocol and the distant echoes of reverent whispers. Yet his heart felt anything but settled. The golden light streaming through stained glass windows painted elaborate patterns across the ancient walls, creating a kaleidoscope of colors that should have brought peace to his soul. Instead, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very foundations of this sacred place were pressing down upon him with invisible force. Cardinal Torretti walked respectfully behind him, maintaining the customary 3 paces of distance, while discreet security personnel flanked the procession with practiced precision. "Your Holiness," Cardinal Torretti ventured softly, his voice barely above a whisper in the hallowed silence. "The schedule indicates your afternoon appointment with the Pontifical Council in 20 minutes. Pope Leo XIV paused mid-stride, his weathered hands clasping together as a strange restlessness coursed through his veins. The afternoon schedule stretched before him like a golden chain, meetings, documents, ceremonies, all necessary, all important, yet somehow feeling increasingly hollow. Through a narrow window, he caught a glimpse of Rome's bustling streets below, where real life pulsed with authentic struggles and genuine need. "Tell me, Cardinal," the Pope said quietly, his eyes still fixed on the world beyond the Vatican walls. "When did we last walk among our people without barriers between us and their reality?" The Cardinal shifted uncomfortably, clearly unprepared for such a philosophical inquiry. "Your Holiness, security protocols require—" "I wasn't asking about protocols," Pope Leo XIV interrupted gently, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the corridor. Something was calling to him from beyond these sacred walls, something that no amount of ceremony or tradition could satisfy. The faces of the faithful from that morning's audience flickered through his memory, but beneath their reverent expressions, he had glimpsed something else, a hunger that transcended physical need, a longing for connection that formal blessings could not fully address. The Pope's fingers traced the simple wooden cross hanging from his neck, a stark contrast to the opulence surrounding him. In that moment, a decision began forming in his heart, one that would shatter every expectation of papal protocol and change the course of an ordinary afternoon forever. Without a word of explanation, Pope Leo XIV turned away from Cardinal Torretti and walked deliberately toward the massive bronze doors that separated the Vatican from the world beyond. His sudden change of direction sent ripples of confusion through the carefully orchestrated routine that governed every papal movement, leaving his entourage scrambling to comprehend this unprecedented deviation from protocol. "Your Holiness." "Please wait," Cardinal Torretti called out, his usually composed voice cracking with alarm. The security detail immediately shifted into high alert, their trained eyes scanning for threats while trying to position themselves between the Pope and his apparent destination. Commander Rossi, head of papal security, stepped forward with barely concealed panic etched across his weathered face. "Holy Father, we haven't conducted the necessary sweeps," Commander Rossi said urgently. "The street protocols aren't in place. If you wish to visit the city, we can arrange—" "I don't wish to visit," Pope Leo XIV replied, with quiet firmness, his hand already reaching for the ancient door handle. "I wish to walk." The Swiss guards exchanged bewildered glances as their pontiff pushed open the heavy doors himself, something no pope had done in living memory. The sudden rush of Roman air filled his lungs, exhaust fumes mixed with fresh bread from nearby bakeries, the distant sound of car horns blending with animated conversations in rapid Italian. It was chaos compared to the ordered silence of the Vatican, and it felt like freedom. Stepping onto the cobblestones of St. Peter's Square, Pope Leo XIV felt the weight of centuries lifting from his shoulders. Tourists and pilgrims scattered, throughout the plaza began to notice the figure in white, moving among them without the usual bulletproof Pope-mobile or phalanx of security. Whispers of recognition rippled through the crowd, like wind through wheat. Behind him, the papal staff erupted into urgent consultations. Cardinal Toretti was already reaching for his phone to contact the Vatican's crisis management team, while Commander Rossi barked orders into his radio, desperately trying to establish a perimeter around a pope who was rapidly disappearing into the maze of Roman streets. But Pope Leo XIV paid no attention to the commotion in his wake. Each step away from the Vatican gates felt like a step towards something essential he had lost without realizing it. The afternoon sun warmed his face as he moved past startled pedestrians, his simple white cassock making him both conspicuous and strangely anonymous among the bustling crowd. Somewhere in this ancient city, he sensed, a moment of profound significance was waiting to unfold. The narrow streets of Rome pulsed with life as Pope Leo XIV walked deeper into the heart of the ancient city. Vendors called out their wares in melodic Italian, their voices weaving together in a symphony of commerce that had echoed through these cobblestone arteries for millennia. The aroma of fresh pasta and roasted coffee beans drifted from trattorias, while colorful displays of ripe tomatoes and fragrant herbs spilled from market stalls like nature's own artwork. A young mother hurried past, her children clutching gelato, cones that dripped rainbow colors onto the warm stones. Their laughter bubbled up between the conversations of well-dressed tourists examining expensive leather goods and locals haggling over the day's catch at the fish market. The abundance was overwhelming. Shop windows gleaming with gold jewelry, restaurants with tables groaning under platters of food, designer boutiques showcasing fashion that cost more than most families earned in months. Yet, as Pope Leo XIV's trained eye swept across the bustling scene, he began to notice the shadows between the light. An elderly woman sat quietly on church steps, her weathered hands extended toward passers-by, who seemed to look right through her. A thin man in tattered clothes searched through a public trash bin, while tourists photographed the fountain just meters away, completely oblivious to his desperate hunger. The Pope paused beside a flower vendor whose bright blooms created a riot of color against the ancient stone wall. "Beautiful day, isn't it, Father?" the vendor said warmly, not recognizing the figure before him, but responding to the kindness in his eyes. "Perhaps some roses for a special lady?" "Indeed beautiful," Pope Leo XIV replied softly, though his gaze had already shifted to a small child sitting alone in a doorway, her bare feet dusty and her dress torn at the hem. The contrast struck him like a physical blow, abundance and deprivation existing side by side, separated by mere steps, yet divided by a chasm of indifference. As he continued walking, each block revealed new layers of this harsh reality. Expensive cars pulled up to curbs where homeless individuals had made cardboard shelters. Restaurants dumped perfectly good food into bins while hungry eyes watched from the shadows. The weight of these observations settled heavy in his chest, each scene burning itself into his memory with startling clarity. Something was drawing him forward now, a pull he couldn't name but felt compelled to follow. The cheerful noise of the market district began to fade as he turned down a quieter side street where the shadows grew longer and the scent of desperation hung heavier in the air. The narrow alley behind the restaurants reeked of rotting food and broken dreams. Pope Leo XV had followed the invisible current that seemed to pull him deeper into Rome's forgotten corners, where the city's gleaming facade gave way to harsh reality. Overflowing dumpsters lined the cramped passage like metal monuments to waste, their contents spilling onto cracked pavements stained with grease and neglect. It was there, crouched beside a particularly battered bin, that he saw him. The man was perhaps 50, though hardship had carved years beyond his age into the deep lines around his eyes. His clothes hung in tatters from a frame that spoke of too many missed meals, and his trembling hands desperately searched through scraps of spoiled food. Marco, though the Pope didn't yet know his name, lifted a mouldy piece of bread to inspect it, his hollow cheeks telling the story of systematic starvation. "Hey, what did I tell you about coming back here?" The voice cracked like a whip through the alley's oppressive silence. A thick-set man in a stained apron emerged from the restaurant's back door, his face twisted with disgust and rage. "You're driving away my customers with your stench." Marco flinched but didn't move away from the dumpster. "Please, signore," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm not bothering anyone, just looking for what? Free meals?" The restaurant owner grabbed Marco by the shoulder and shoved him hard against the brick wall. "This is private property. You want food? Get a job. Stop being a parasite." Pope Leo XIV felt something ignite in his chest, a righteous fire that burned away years of diplomatic restraint. He watched as Marco stumbled, his dignity stripped away as surely as if he'd been physically beaten. The homeless man's eyes darted around desperately, seeking escape from this public humiliation, but finding only more walls closing in around him. "I'm calling the police," the owner continued, pulling out his phone with theatrical menace. "Maybe a night in jail will teach you to respect other people's property." The cruelty was breathtaking in its casual efficiency. Here, mere blocks from the Vatican, where Christ's message of love echoed daily through ancient halls, a human being was being treated like vermin for the crime of hunger. Marco's shoulders sagged in defeat, and he began gathering the few coins, scattered at his feet with shaking hands. In that moment, Pope Leo XIV understood why he had been called from his gilded chambers into this alley. Some encounters are destined, written in the stars and carried on divine wind. This was his. "Excuse me." The words cut through the alley's tension like a blade through silk. Pope Leo XIV stepped forward from the shadows, his white cassock catching the afternoon light that filtered between the buildings. The restaurant owner froze mid-gesture, his phone still raised, while Marco looked up with eyes that had long since stopped expecting rescue from any quarter. "I said, excuse me." The Pope's voice carried an authority that had nothing to do with titles or position. It was the quiet power of absolute moral certainty. Several passers-by had begun to gather at the alley's entrance, drawn by the raised voices, and now transfixed by the unmistakable figure of the pontiff himself. The restaurant owner's face cycled through confusion, recognition, and mounting panic. In the span of seconds, Your Holiness? What are you doing here?" "I might ask you the same question," Pope Leo XIV replied, moving closer to where Marco still cowered against the wall. The homeless man stared in bewilderment, unable to process the surreal nature of what was unfolding before him. "Though I believe I already know the answer." A murmur rippled through the growing crowd as more people recognized the Pope. Cell phones appeared like magic, their cameras trained on a scene that defied all precedent. Words spread through the narrow street with lightning speed. The Pope was here, in this filthy alley, confronting a situation that most would hurry past without a second glance. "Holy Father, you don't understand," the restaurant owner stammered, his earlier aggression evaporating like steam. "This man, he's been bothering my customers, going through my garbage. It's bad for business. People don't want to eat where they see this." Pope Leo XIV turned his gaze to Marco, who seemed to shrink further into himself under the weight of so much attention. The homeless man's shame was palpable, radiating from him like heat from sun-baked stone. In his eyes, the Pope saw not just hunger for food, but a deeper starvation, for dignity, for recognition, for the simple acknowledgement of his humanity. The alley had become an amphitheater, with every eye fixed on the Pope as he stood at the crossroads between comfortable indifference and radical compassion. The weight of centuries of papal protocol pressed down upon him, whispering of appropriate channels and proper procedures. But louder still was the voice that had called him from his chambers, demanding something unprecedented. The moment stretched, taut as a wire, pregnant with possibility and fraught with consequence. Everything that happened next would echo far beyond this forgotten corner of Rome. Without hesitation, Pope Leo XIV lowered himself to his knees on the filthy alley floor. The simple act shattered every expectation, every protocol, every assumption about papal dignity that had been carefully constructed over centuries. His white cassock settled into the grime and grease that stained the cracked pavement, absorbing the muck of forgotten corners where society's unwanted sought their daily survival. The gathering crowd drew in a collective breath, some crossing themselves reflexively at witnessing something that felt both scandalous and sacred. Marco recoiled as if struck, pressing himself harder against the brick wall. His weathered face contorted with confusion and terror. This couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. Popes didn't kneel in garbage-strewn alleys. Popes didn't lower themselves to the level of society's cast-offs. Yet here was the most powerful religious figure in the world, eye to eye with him, close enough that Marco could see the genuine compassion radiating from those weathered features. "What's your name?" Pope Leo XIV asked softly, his voice carrying only gentleness now, as if they were the only two people in the world. Marco's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. His hands trembled as he clutched the few coins he'd gathered, knuckles white with desperate grip. The kindness in the Pope's voice was almost unbearable. When had anyone last spoken to him without contempt, without the edge of disgust that he'd grown accustomed to hearing? I'm Marco," he finally whispered, the words barely audible above the distant traffic and the stunned murmur of onlookers. "Marco," the Pope repeated, as if the name itself were precious. "I'm Leo. It's an honor to meet you." The restaurant owner stood frozen, his phone forgotten in his hand, unable to process the complete inversion of everything he thought he understood about power and position. Behind him, the crowd had swelled to dozens, but maintained a respectful distance, sensing they were witnessing something historic. Marco's eyes filled with tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years. The simple recognition of his humanity, the acknowledgement that he was worthy of a pope's time, of anyone's time, cracked something deep within his chest. His shame wrestled with a desperate hunger for this impossible kindness, while his survival instinct screamed that it couldn't last, that disappointment would follow as surely as night followed day. "Why?" Marco managed to choke out, his voice breaking. "Why are you?" The question hung in the air between them, encompassing everything. Why kneel? Why care? Why risk everything for someone the world had already written off? Pope Leo XIV remained, perfectly still, allowing Marco's question to settle between them like dust finding its natural place. The alley had become a sanctuary of sorts, the crowd instinctively forming a protective circle that kept the curious at bay while preserving the sacred intimacy of the moment. Even the restaurant owner had stepped back, his earlier aggression replaced by something approaching reverence. "Because you're hungry," the Pope said simply, his voice carrying no trace of condescension or pity. "And because I've been hungry. And too, though perhaps not in the same way." Marco's fingers loosened slightly around his coins, though he didn't let them go entirely. Trust was a luxury he'd learned to live without, yet something in the Pope's steady presence made his defensive walls tremble. "You don't understand," he whispered, his voice thick with years of accumulated shame. I'm nothing. Just garbage, like he said." "Look at me, Marco." The Pope's words were gentle but firm. When Marco finally raised his eyes, he saw no judgment, no disgust, only a depth of understanding that seemed to pierce straight through to his soul. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Marco shook his head, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. I see a man who has survived what would break most people. I see someone who has been forgotten by the world, but not by God. I see my brother. The words hit Marco like physical blows, each one cracking away another layer of the protective shell he'd built around his heart. His breath came in short, sharp gasps as he fought against the unfamiliar sensation of being truly seen. The crowd around them seemed to fade into background noise, their cameras and whispered conversations becoming distant and irrelevant. "I haven't eaten in 3 days," Marco confessed suddenly, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside him. "I wasn't stealing, I was just so hungry." Pope Leo XIV nodded with infinite patience, as if he had all the time in the world to spend in this filthy alley with a man society had deemed worthless. "When did you last have a real meal? Something warm, something prepared with care?" Marco's face crumpled as he tried to remember. Weeks, months. The question revealed the true depth of his deprivation, not just of food, but of the simple human dignity that came with being nourished by another's hands. "Would you allow me to change that?" the Pope asked quietly. Pope Leo XIV rose slowly from the alley floor, his white cassock now bearing the honest stains of Rome's forgotten corners. He extended his hand to Marco, who stared at it as if it might vanish like a cruel mirage. When Marco finally accepted the offered help, his legs trembled beneath him. Whether from hunger, emotion, or sheer disbelief, neither man could say. "Come," the Pope said gently. "Let's walk together." They emerged from the alley into the broader streets, and immediately the atmosphere shifted. Word had spread through the district like wildfire, carried by the dozens of cell phone videos already racing across social media platforms. Shopkeepers stepped from their doorways. Tourists abandoned their guidebooks, and even traffic seemed to slow as drivers craned their necks to witness the impossible sight. The Pope walking side by side with one of Rome's invisible homeless. Marco's steps grew increasingly hesitant as the attention intensified. Every few meters, he would glance sideways at Pope Leo XIV, waiting for the moment when reality would reassert itself and this dream would shatter. His survival instincts, honed by years of disappointment, whispered constant warnings. This couldn't last. Important people didn't waste time on worthless vagrants. The inevitable abandonment was coming. "They're staring," Marco muttered, his voice barely audible above the growing murmur of the crowd that had begun following at a respectful distance. "Yes, they are," the Pope agreed without breaking stride. "Does that bother you?" Marco considered the question seriously. For so long, being stared at had meant judgment, disgust, or the prelude to being moved along by authorities. But walking beside the Pope, he felt something different, not shame, but a strange kind of dignity he'd forgotten. He possessed. "I keep thinking you're going to change your mind," Marco admitted, his honesty surprising them both. Pope Leo XIV stopped walking and turned to face him fully. The crowd behind them halted as well, creating a ripple effect through the street. "Marco, I want you to understand something. This isn't charity. This isn't a photo opportunity. This is what should have happened long ago." In the distance, the distinctive sound of news helicopters began to thrum overhead. Vatican security vehicles had appeared at strategic intersections, their occupants looking simultaneously relieved to have located their pontiff and horrified at the international incident unfolding in real time. Marco looked up at the approaching chaos and felt his chest tighten with familiar panic. "Maybe I should go," he whispered. The Vatican kitchens had never witnessed such a scene. Pope Leo XIV guided Marco through corridors lined with Renaissance frescoes, past Swiss guards who struggled to maintain their composure while watching their pontiff escort a homeless man to what was traditionally the most exclusive dining room in Christendom. Marco's bare feet whispered against marble floors that had been walked by saints and emperors, his tattered clothes a stark contrast to the opulent surroundings. Cardinal Toretti arrived breathless, having sprinted through half the Vatican complex. After receiving frantic reports of the Pope's return, his face cycled through relief, horror, and barely contained panic as he took in the scene before him. "Your Holiness," he began carefully, "perhaps we should discuss preparing a meal." Pope Leo XIV interrupted firmly, settling Marco into a chair at the papal dining table as if he were hosting the most honored guest in the world. Something warm and nourishing. Marco hasn't eaten properly in days. The kitchen staff stood frozen in the doorway, their eyes wide with confusion. Chef Benedetto, who had served 3 previous pontiffs with impeccable discretion, clutched his white hat as if it might anchor him to reality. Never in his 40-year career had he been asked to serve someone who looked like they'd been sleeping rough for months. "Holy Father," Cardinal Toretti tried again, his voice strained with diplomatic necessity, "there are protocols, health considerations. The international media can wait," the Pope said, his tone brooking. No argument. He turned to Marco, who sat rigidly in the ornate chair, overwhelmed by the grandeur surrounding him. "What would you like to eat, my friend?" Marco's voice came out as barely a whisper. I don't know. Anything. I'm not supposed to be here." The words cut through the room's tension like a blade. Chef Benedetto stepped forward, his professional instincts overriding his confusion. "Perhaps some minestrone, fresh bread, something gentle for the stomach?" "Perfect." Pope Leo XIV smiled, then fixed his gaze on the assembled staff and advisors. "This man is our guest. He will be treated with the same respect and care we would show any visiting dignitary." Cardinal Toretti opened his mouth to protest, then closed it as he met the Pope's unwavering stare. The kitchen staff exchanged glances, their initial shock giving way to something approaching understanding. This wasn't a publicity stunt or a momentary impulse. Their Pope was making a statement that would echo far beyond these ancient walls. As the aroma of fresh soup began to fill the air, Marco's eyes filled with tears he could no longer contain. The Vatican guest quarters were modest by papal standards, yet to Marco they felt like a palace. He sat on the edge of a simple bed, freshly bathed and wearing clean clothes provided by the staff, still unable to fully accept that this wasn't an elaborate dream. Pope Leo XIV sat across from him in a wooden chair, the formality of his office, stripped away in the gentle lamplight that softened the room's ancient stone walls. "Tell me about your life before the streets," the Pope said quietly, his voice carrying the patient warmth of someone prepared to listen without judgment. Marco's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the bed. For years, he had buried his past, so deeply that speaking of it felt like excavating his own grave. "I had a family once," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "A wife, Maria. A daughter, Sophia. She would be 23 now if she's still..." The words caught in his throat like broken glass. Pope Leo XIV waited, offering no pressure, no hurried encouragement, just presence. "I was a teacher," Marco continued, the admission seeming to surprise even him. "History. I loved those children, loved opening their minds to the stories of those who came before us. Maria used to joke that I cared more about dead Romans than living bills. A ghost of a smile flickered across his weathered face before the darkness returned. Then Sophia got sick. Leukemia. The treatments, the medications, the experimental procedures we couldn't afford but couldn't refuse. We sold everything. The house, the car, Maria's grandmother's jewelry. When that wasn't enough, I borrowed money from people I shouldn't have borrowed from." Pope Leo XIII leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Marco's face as the story unfolded like a map of accumulated trauma. The debts became impossible When I couldn't pay, they didn't just threaten me, they threatened my girls. So I left. I thought if I disappeared, they'd be safe. I planned to come back when I could make things right, when I could protect them properly." Marco's voice cracked completely. "That was 8 years ago. Sophia died 6 months after I left. Maria remarried a good man. They have a son now. I've watched them sometimes from a distance. They're happy, they're safe. Without me." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of sacrifice and loss. Outside, Rome slept peacefully, unaware that within these ancient walls, one man was finally allowing another to see the full measure of his pain. "You gave up everything for love," Pope Leo XIV said finally, his words carrying the power of absolution. The Vatican had become the epicenter of a global phenomenon that no one could have predicted. News crews from every major network crowded St. Peter's Square, their satellite trucks creating a technological fortress around the ancient basilica. The footage of Pope Leo XIV kneeling in the alley had been viewed over 100 million times in just 48 hours, sparking conversations in languages across every continent. But it wasn't just media attention that had transformed the Vatican's atmosphere. They came slowly at first, 1 or 2 individuals with weathered faces and desperate eyes, drawn by something they couldn't quite name. Marco watched from a window as small groups of homeless people began gathering at the Vatican gates, not demanding entry, but simply sitting in quiet vigil, as if proximity to where their story had begun might offer some salvation of their own. "Look at what you've started," Marco said to Pope Leo XIV, as they observed the growing crowd below. His voice carried wonder mixed with overwhelming responsibility. In 3 days, he had gone from invisible to the face of a movement he never asked to represent. "Not me," the Pope replied firmly. This was always bigger than one moment, one person. Your story, our story, it's awakened something that was already there, waiting." Cardinal Toretti appeared in the doorway, his usually composed demeanor showing signs of strain. "Holy Father, we have requests for interviews from 67 media outlets. The UN Secretary-General wishes to discuss your poverty initiative, though we haven't announced any such program. And there are now nearly 300 people gathered outside our gates." Through the window, they could see familiar signs among the crowd, cardboard signs with simple messages: "See us, we exist, dignity for all." Some held photos of family members they'd lost touch with. Others simply sat in patient silence, finding strength in numbers. Marco felt the weight of their expectation settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "They think I have answers," he whispered. "They think because I'm here, because this happened to me, that I can somehow—" "What, save them all?" Pope Leo XIV placed a gentle hand on Marco's shoulder. "You don't need to save anyone. You just need to remember who saved you. Not me, but the courage to accept love when it was offered. That courage is contagious." Below them, the crowd continued to grow, each face carrying its own story of loss, abandonment, and fragile hope. The world was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The building that had once housed Vatican administrative offices now pulsed with a different kind of sacred energy. Marco stood in the main hall of the Casa della Dignità, watching as 37 formerly homeless individuals moved through their morning routines with purpose that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. The walls, painted in warm yellows and soft blues, bore artwork created by residents. Not the polished masterpieces of Renaissance masters, but raw, honest expressions of survival and hope. "Maria finished her nursing certification yesterday," announced Giuseppe, a former street dweller who now managed the center's educational programs. His weathered hands held up a certificate with the same reverence others might reserve for papal documents. "She starts at Santo Spirito Hospital next week." Marco smiled, remembering Maria's first day at the center. A woman who had convinced herself she was too old, too damaged, too far gone to learn anything new. Now she would be healing. Others, carrying forward the same radical compassion that had rescued them all from invisibility. The transformation stories multiplied daily. Roberto had reconnected with his estranged son through the center's family reconciliation program. Elena was teaching Italian to refugees. Father Benedetto had left his parish to serve as the center's chaplain full-time. Pope Leo XIV entered quietly, as was his habit during these morning gatherings. He moved among the residents with easy familiarity, stopping to examine Roberto's carpentry project, listening to Elena practice her English phrases, sharing a laugh with Father Benedetto over the morning's newspaper headlines. The transformation was visible in his face too. The weight of protocol had lifted, replaced by something far more sustaining. The man who had once felt trapped by ceremony now found liberation in authentic service. The Rome City Council approved our proposal, Marco told him quietly, as they walked toward the kitchen where breakfast was being prepared by residents who had once fought over garbage scraps. The aroma of fresh bread and coffee created an atmosphere of abundance that stood in stark contrast to the scarcity these people had known for years. The Pope nodded thoughtfully. And the resistance? Marco's expression grew more serious. Cardinal, Montenegro is still pushing for a review of unconventional programs. Some donors have withdrawn support. The traditionalist newspapers are calling it socialism investments. There's pressure from certain Vatican factions to return to traditional papal duties. They paused beside a window overlooking the courtyard, where children from a nearby school played with residents as part of their community service program. The sight never failed to move Marco, watching society's throwaway people become teachers, mentors, bridges between worlds that had been artificially separated. One 8-year-old girl sat cross-legged beside Antonio, listening with rapt attention, as he explained the migration patterns of birds he'd observed during his years sleeping in parks. "Do you ever regret it?" Pope Leo XIV asked suddenly. "The attention, the responsibility, the way your life was turned upside down?" Marco considered the question seriously. Through the window he could see Angelo leading a group of teenagers, in planting tomatoes. The same man who had been arrested 17 times for vagrancy, now teaching civic engagement through urban gardening. "I think about my daughter sometimes," he said finally. "Wonder what she would think of all this, whether she would be proud or embarrassed that her father became the face of homelessness. What do you think she would say?" "I think—" Marco's voice caught slightly. "I think she would say that love looks different than we expect it to. That sometimes it shows up in alleys behind restaurants instead of greeting cards and flowers. That the father she lost isn't gone. He just found a different way to teach." A commotion in the courtyard drew their attention. A young woman had arrived at the gates, her clothes torn, her eyes holding the same desperate hunger Marco remembered from his own reflection in storefront windows. She clutched a newspaper clipping, the original photo of Pope Leo XIV kneeling in the alley, as if it were a map to salvation. Behind her stood an older man with a cardboard sign reading, "Veteran, please help," and a teenage boy who looked barely 16. "The work continues," the Pope observed quietly, watching as several residents moved toward the gates without being asked, their own experiences of rescue transforming them into rescuers. Marco was already moving toward the door, his coordinators. Badge forgotten as older instincts took over, the instinct of one rescued person recognizing another in need of rescue. "It always does," he replied. "The question is whether we'll be ready for it." As he walked toward the gates to greet their newest arrivals, Marco carried with him the same radical possibility that had transformed his own life. That dignity was not earned but inherent, that love was not scarce but abundant, and that sometimes the most profound revolutions began with the simple act of seeing another human being as worthy of care. The story was far from over. In truth, it was just beginning.